If you're here to discover a new way to play the Petroff defense with knight f6, then you've come to the right place. It's GMX here, and today we are going to be diving into the Damiano Petroff, which is a line that used to be thought to be very bad for black, but actually proves to be very playable. And it is the move of knight takes e4 in this position, which you may have thought that, well, this is just a blunder because queen e2 and, black can't play knight f6 because knight c6 will discover an attack and win the queen. And if you play queen to e7, then white just plays queen takes c4, d6, and, white just wins the pawn in this instance. But as we'll see in this video, things are not so simple, and modern engine analysis and correspondence play has shown that after knight c6, black is actually able to equalize from this position with precise play, which immediately came as a bit of a shock to me, but it's what the engine showed at a very high depth. If you are enjoying this video, do make sure to leave a like and to consider subscribing. And also worth pointing out that there are some alternatives white can play, where they can also play moves like knight c3, which are going to face quite a lot online. In fact, I face this even more than knight e5 personally. Also bishop c4 you'll see quite a bit. Moves like d4 become more popular at a higher level. We're going to touch on all of these so that you have a full repertoire against the move 1 e4. Also, of course, touching on things like bishop's opening, knight c3, center game, and d4. We're going to give solutions to all of these in this this training so that you can start playing the system right away without needing to do any additional research of your own. So to recap, the Damiano Petroff is knight e5, and not the move d6 and not the Stafford with knight c6, but the symmetrical knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7, take, d4. And here's where we have our first fork in the road, where what most of your opponents are going to play is the move of bishop to b5. They can also play other moves like bishop f4, f4, and knight to c3, and we're going to dive into each of these today. But let's start with bishop b5. I want to really make this video as practical for you as possible and make sure we cover the moves that you're actually going to face most often. So turns out actually castling is the most common move by white in practice. Again, knight c3 is probably a better move, and we will get to a bit later. We're just a little bit more flexible to have the option to castle long in some lines. But if they do castle, kind of the first point to note here is that it's actually not so easy for white to keep his extra pawn. Like, if you play a move such as rook e1, for example, as white, it appears to defend the pawn, but actually black can take it with knight takes e5. Because if white plays bishop d7, we're just going to take with the rook. And white can't actually play queen takes e5, because at the end of the captures, there'll be rook d1 a backrack checkmate. And these tactics basically allow us to just get a fully equal position. Computer thinks that black is the one fighting for an advantage in this case due to the weakness of the c2 pawn, but I think you get the idea that black is not experiencing any problems whatsoever. And likewise, if white does play something like bishop e to c6, yeah, it keeps the extra pawn alive, but it comes at a very big price, where after, say, queen f5, and a move such as, black can play almost any move here, really. Like, even the exchange of queens, actually. Even here, black still has very good compensation for the pawn because of his bishop pair. And also we can attack the g6, e5 pawn as well and really put a lot of pressure on white in this way. So definitely quite a nice example of black's compensation. But if you do want to keep the pieces on the board, bishop d7 and playing to open things up would also be quite adequate. But I personally like queen d7 best here. So we can see that castling's not really giving white any sort of advantage, and this is why if you're playing strong opponents, they're going to play the move knight c3 most likely. Still, we're going to castle here, and if they do defend their pawn with bishop f4, which is kind of what you would expect, if you're wanting to play a more dynamic approach, you can look into a move like g5, but the reliable one is just to play queen to b4. And once you remember this queen b4 idea, the rest sort of just kind of comes into place, where you're happy if they play queen b4 because then your bishop develops with the recapture. And if they play castles long, well, do you guys remember the trick here in this position to exploit the undefended bishop on b5? Yeah, exactly. We just play knight takes c5 and do a little bit of an elastic band trick where we're obviously quite happy to get the bishop pair, but also after take. Black is going to be doing fine here, where you might be a bit concerned about a move like knight g5 in this position, hitting the pawn on f7. But it turns out we can actually ignore it with the move bishop e7. Because now if white plays the move knight takes f7, we can play the move rook df8, take, and rook f4. And even though white is currently up in exchange on a pawn, the problem is his knight is completely trapped and there's no way to get out. And after rook e1, rook he1, king to d8, we defend our minor pieces. We're ready to go rook f8 and pick up the knight. And after, say, rook e6, rook f8, take, knight e6, and a move rook f7, we're just going to put our bishop on d6, now knight on f6. And this will give black a perfectly fine position. If there's one position that you may want to play out against a human or computer after this training, it's probably this one. But yeah, objectively, black has no problems whatsoever here. And, well, it's also possible for white to not play bishop b5. He does have some alternatives to this rather obvious pin. But we can see that white's not really getting any sort of advantage with bishop b5 here. At first, the engine will tell you white's better with pretty much any move, but as we go deeper, we'll realize it's not the case. And actually, after bishop f4, it turns out that g5 sets a really devilish trap where white should probably actually just retreat his bishop along this diagonal and just let us get back the pawn and equalize. But what most of your opponents will do is, the vast majority of them will play bishop g3 to defend the pawn. And this is actually a decisive mistake. Now, of course, I'm not showing that Damiano as a trappy opening. I'm showing it more as a reliable system to get at least a draw in the worst case, even against the best players in the world, as has been shown in correspondence play. But f5 is the key. They can't take en passant because the queen would be on, but if the queen moves away, we just go f4 and just Noah's Ark's trap the bishop to just win the game that way. So that's a pretty simple trap, pretty easy to understand, and something that you're actually going to get in a decent chunk of your games, especially online. Now, if white plays f4, this does very stably defend the extra pawn, but it has the disadvantage after bishop g4 that the white king is going to be quite exposed. Where, for example, if bishop to b5, we can actually ignore the attack on the knight with castles and threaten mate with rook to d1. Well, it's not technically mate because king f2, but we have a mating attack, basically. And if white plays a move like knight c3 to cover it, well, we can then just play knight d4, and we can sort of see how black is managed to take control of the game, because we're threatening the move of bishop f5 to skewer the queen to the c2 pawn. So it's just going to be really bad for white, and note that castling also is no good, because queen c5 and the Damiano is just full of these little tricks like this, where you can just even win material directly if they are not paying attention. Of course, it's better to play like knight c3, and it's better to develop the queen side instead. But even here, like queen b4 once again is going to give black very good compensation. One salty is we are going to take back with the knight rather than the bishop, and just use the pressure against the c2 pawn to regain our pawn and basically equalize, as it were. This leaves us with... Also, one thing I forgot to mention before is that we will be looking at queen e5 as well, because it is something you will see a lot in your games online, just trying to trade off the queens and say they're up a pawn in the ending. But before we get to that, I do want to mention what is sort of the worst case scenario for us. It's a move that you're probably only going to face among relatively well-prepared players, but the move knight c3 does give white the best chance of an advantage here. And the idea of giving back the pawn like this is that with the move of bishop to f4, white does get a little bit of an initiative here. Note, by the way, if they do play a move like knight b5, you can play bishop b4 and, c3, bishop a5 does defend the pawn. Or if bishop d2, it turns out that, this position is also going to be fine for black, where I don't think you're going to face this position after knight d7 enough for it to be really worth going into super deeply here. That'd be more for the very advanced students. But yeah, it turns out that if you analyze it more deeply, you'll find that the black is basically just doing fine. But yeah, the king is stuck on d8, but their king is also on d2 in a sense, and black has no weaknesses. It's a very typical example of how black holds the draw quite comfortably in this variation. But bishop f4 is what you're going to see more often, and after bishop to d6, quite a few of your opponents actually are not going to see you're afraid of playing knight f3 or knight d3 to pick up the bishop pair, which is why I should play bishop g3, because castling just runs into knight d3, and once you get the bishop pair advantage, you're just never going to be worse in a position like this. If anything, it's already probably black who is fighting for the advantage in such an instance. But yeah, bishop g3 is the way to go. And here is where, if you're an advanced player, you're really going to want to make sure you remember this next move for black. Because in the past, people were sort of playing like f6, bishop d7, and just sort of playing a bit passively. But it turns out h5 is going to be the key move, where we're going to prepare h4 to hit his bishop. And if they play knight b5, which sort of surprisingly is the most common move in Lee chess, we're just going to play h4, and they can take if they want to, but we're going to go bishop f5 and rook c8, and just have this very nice play with our active pieces. A position like this might look initially a little better for white, but we're going to go f6, g5. We'll be able to create counterplay on the queen side, and that is going to more or less solve our problems here from black's point of view. In any case, probably at more advanced levels, you're going to see like castling more, but you're just going to play h6, go for h4, and there's a lot of like analysis being done, like the positions after knight b5, and h4 can get pretty sort of hair-raising, but basically it turns out this sort of position after like bishop f4, g5, it looks better for white because of the bishop pair and the isolated pawn, but once again we do get enough counterplay on the queen side to be able to gradually equalize in this instance. And if they do play like h4, that's not too much of a problem. Just bishop d7, just recycle the knight for the bishop, and you're never really going to lose from this sort of position, realistically speaking, if you've like looked at it a little bit yourself. But yeah, that's sort of the overview of like the position after knight c6. We can see it even in the worst case scenario of knight c3, like is still getting a slightly worse ending where he's able to steadily steer the ship toward full equality, and basically, make a draw, or if white makes a mistake, we can even start exploring our winning chances. And given that the vast majority of opponents are not going to be prepared for the Damiano Petroff at all, it's a decent chance of getting that. When it's not going to play the optimal way, most likely. Now, we're pretty happy to see take, actually, because in this case, after bishop f5, we do have some pressure against this pawn. In lead chess, actually, white most often will play the rather serious mistake of bishop d3. It's a mistake because now the white has two weak pawns in the center, and actually Cyrus Akdawala, who wrote a book on the Damiano Petroff very recently with Carsten Hansen, actually had a game from this sort of position quite recently, and after knight b4, it just turns out white can't really defend his pawn, because you're also having a cover with knight c2, and after king d2 long castles, like we can see, the black is just going to be better with his regaining the pawn and having the initiative to boot here. Well, it does have alternatives, but like c3 runs into knight d7, and if they play f4, you have a few different options. Like you can go f6 immediately, or you can castle first and then play f6, and just kind of open up their center. And once their centers open up, it's very easy to just bring the rook to the e file, and it's just very hard for white to consolidate his extra pawn in this instance. It's something that you may want to play out in your own time, but yeah, it turns out that this position is already much better for black due to the weakness of white's king being in the center, which does prove to be a thing even in the end game. So those are kind of the main ideas of the Damiano Petroff itself. Final point I'll mention is if they do play a move like f4, we can flick in the move f5 and then take, and this position here is just going to be completely fine for black. where one thing that most people play on lead chess is most will play to move d4, but this is just a blunder after queen h4. You just pick up the pawn and you are just clearly better here. So yeah, you can see how like your opponents, there are a lot of traps they can easily fall into, but even if they don't fall into the traps, you still get a perfectly fine position. Going back to position after knight e4, I mean, queen e2 is just the most natural move by a pretty clear margin. If they play queen f3, you just play knight g5, defend and attack at the same time. And I mean, only black can really be better in a position like this one, where white is, just wasting way too much time moving the queen around early. And if they do play a move such as, well, if they play bishop c4, we'll kind of get to that under free bishop c4. If they play d3, we're just going to play knight f6, d4, and it's going to end up after d6 like transposing into a French exchange with knight f3, knight f6, which could also get in one of the lines of the Petroff as well. But it's nothing too much to be concerned about. Just play symmetrically, and you're not going to have too many problems. Let's say it's like h3, h6, bishop g5, bishop g4. This sort of thing, like just make your life easy by just copying white, not allowing him to, get some favorable imbalance. And yeah, if knights are even here, like the same, copycat logic still works as such. But anyway, although it is true, probably bishop g4 is maybe a little more precise, but okay, I'm digressing a little bit here. In any case, instead of d3, if they play d4, then, we're just going to play d5, and after bishop d3, it will transpose back to what we'll see with the free d4 move order. So most of the time it is going to transpose, maybe the one tricky move is knight f7, and you're hoping we blunder into queen h5, but then after queen e7, it's going to be black who is winning with a very similar trick to what we saw at the very start of the training. So with that being said, let's have a very quick look at the alternatives. It's not going to be like a full repertoire, but at least to give you a starting point to work with. Where after knight c3, if you already have experience with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, of course you could play knight c6 and transpose into the 4 knights, but it's probably a better subject for a separate video, let's say. But if you are looking for a shortcut, you can play bishop b4 and basically play a Berlin with colors reversed, because most of your opponent's going to play passive moves like d3 and just let you take the center, or play bishop c4 and just let you like take, and just have this anti-Berlin kind of setup in a sense, where the extra tempo doesn't really do that much for white in a way, because, the bishop would probably rather be on d3 than c4. Of course, though, the worst case scenario is if they play knight takes e5, and then we're going to castle, they might play, they can either go knight d3 or bishop e2, like either move order is possible, but, you're basically going to get some position like this one with knight e4, and I mean, I've played these positions in some games myself recently, and, white is slightly better with the bishop pair, but black is reasonably solid with no real weaknesses. You can play like f3, knight f6, rook e1, and h6 is a move I kind of had forgotten to play in my games, but, just avoids the annoying bishop g5 pin. You're going to play like bishop to f5 and, knight d7, and, white's a little bit better, but it's definitely a playable position for black, as it were. So that's kind of the worst case, a little shortcut if you want to, avoid a lot of theory studying the 4-knight systems. If they play bishop c4, this is not really a very good move, like after knight e4. Most of your opponents are going to play knight e5. I mean, if they go knight c3, then, you can take and play f6, and, if you know some theory, you're just going to have a pretty significant advantage out of the opening as such. There's not too much to see here. Knight h4 and g6 is this sort of an old line that just ends up being a bit of a dead end for white, where white just never really manages to get the play he needs on the king side to justify the pawn deficit. But if they go knight e5, you just play d5. If they retreat the bishop back, you just play bishop d6, develop normally, and you're just better. And if they play bishop b3, which is what most of your opponents will do, just queen g5 forks the knight and the pawn, and just like that, it's already just game over for white in a position like this. For example, white can already resign. So bishop c4 is just clearly bad, and probably the trickiest move for us to deal with is going to be the move of d4. Because most people, yeah, let white go e5 and just get a good position, but a good answer, though, is to play just knight takes e4. If d takes e5, d5 is the solid approach, and bishop c5 is a bit more dynamic in case you want to just go after f2 and set problems this way. And if your opponent's not prepared, this is probably going to be the best approach because, yeah, a move like bishop e3 is, obviously this is not really what white is hoping for in a sense. And queen d5, knight g5 saves our knight, as it were. But if they play a move like bishop d3 instead, then yeah, you can just play d5, knight takes e5. If d takes e5, you can just follow the Gukesh Abbasov candidates game with knight c5 and just normal development from there. But after knight e5, yeah, we can just play bishop d6, just keep the symmetry. And then if they play c4, you kind of have a choice of options where either you can play bishop e5 and enter these very forcing lines, which do ultimately prove to be fine for black. Queen c2, bishop f5. This is how it normally plays. We kind of end up sacrificing a pawn temporarily, but with knight d4, you have some nice tricks available. We're after takes and here. Yeah, it's a bit of a long line, but at the end of the day, you end up getting a position where you have the two knights competing against their two bishops, and yeah, white's probably a tiny bit better here, but if you play out the lines long enough, black ends up eventually managing to equalize as such. And if you're willing to, do a bit more study, you can also look at the move c5, which leaves some very sharp play, but, if you have memorized your details, this line is also a way for black to quite reliably achieve equality as such. So, yeah, that's pretty much the key ideas I want to share within the Petroff, just to conclude with a couple of options against the alternatives to knight f3. Against bishop c4, I'd probably just go knight f6 and c6 and just take the center with d5, and that's going to make your life pretty easy. There are some little subtleties where you can flick in bishop b4 or a5 before the bishop goes to d6, but even the old main line of bishop d6 is still giving black a reasonably solid position with the extra space in the center. If white goes knight c3, I tend to like the move knight f6 a bit more than knight c6, so that if they play df4, we can go at d5 and just hit back in the center with quite decent play. And if they go queen f3, f5 is one nice reply that you might like to explore on your own time. Just going for something like this, for instance. With good play for black in the center. And if they play bishop c4, you also gain the option of knight takes e4 and going for d5, which, you don't really have this option if you put the knight on c6 first. And, most of your opponents are not going to know the move queen h5, which is the only way really to avoid a worse position. But yeah, you go knight d6, you basically just let them take back the pawn, but on the other hand, yeah, you do get a perfectly fine position to play with in this case. Black has clearly no problems to worry about here. And if they play g3, like d5 is, pretty much everything is going to be fine, but yeah, like d5 and, just playing something like this is going to be, simple enough to equalize as black. If they play something like d4, the center game, I'm not too concerned about this. Like, you just go knight c6, knight f6, bishop to b4 in general, and you're just going to have a very good game, basically. Just applying all the pressure against e4. And if they play Danish Gambit, a pretty practical approach is just to give back the pawn with d5 and just have this nice pressure on the center, like knight c6, bishop g4, and you're never going to be worse in a position like this. And finally, if f4, one little nice shortcut that was shared by Nikos Aterlis in his article on the Damiano Petroff for chess foreman. Of course, e4 is going to be objectively the best move here, but he shared this nice little shortcut of playing knight to f6 with the idea that after takes and takes a knight to f3, which is aiming against queen h4 check, the black has this quite nice idea of knight g5, which is actually an old idea of the late New Zealand IM Robert Wade. The idea being that after d4, the only move that really makes sense here, but then black just takes, just trades off everything. Queen h4 is a fork on the king and the pawn. king f, queen f2, take, and d6, and black just has very solid equality here. We have no weaknesses. We just develop our pieces nice and actively, and there's just absolutely nothing for black to fear. So yeah, that was my overview of the Damiano Petroff, and we can see that in all of the lines, black is gradually managing to equalize, with this sort of being the key position where knight c3 will give white the best chance for an advantage. But you're probably going to face bishop b5 the most often in your own games. So if you do happen to revisit this video later to refresh your memory, then those are the areas that you may like to focus on, as it were, because that's what you're going to get the most often. And yeah, you're also going to get a lot of queen takes e5, so something you're also going to want to check. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, do make sure to leave a like and to also consider subscribing. And let me know in the comments below, like, what was sort of the most surprising aspect of the Damiano Petroff to you? Like, did you sort of think, there was some position where you thought, white is just going to be much better here, and were surprised that, black was fine? Maybe you were a bit more surprised by, like, the different range of tactics and traps, and one of those traps made a big impression on you. Whatever the case may be, let me know in the comments below, and yeah, I'll see you in the next training. Take care.